Tyler Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And in this episode, we're going to be taking, taking a look at something actually quite recent, which is becoming a bit of a habit of ours. We'll be looking at an issue of Notes from Below, their second issue, titled Technology and the Worker, which kind of it's a collection of essays that center around these kind of notions of how technology and the workplace kind of intersect, which is right up our alley, of course. But yeah, for a bit of background, Notes from Below is an online publication that you can find at notesfrombelow.org. And reading from their About page, Notes from Below is the publication of the Class Inquiry Group, an organization of militants committed to socialism, by which we mean the self-emancipation of the working class from capitalism and the state. And yeah, this is a really cool collection of essays. There's quite a lot of them in there, and I definitely recommend the listener check them out. But we're going to be looking at three in particular. We're going to be looking at prospects for organizing the tech industry, bringing back the Lucas Plan, and the future of work, automation, and the left. I think this is quite good stuff, and I'm really encouraged to see a publication dedicating an entire issue to looking at all these kinds of problems.
And I like the format that they have here because it's pretty easy to just load one of these articles up in your Kindle or your Firefox reader or whatever. This is usually how I read them, and just spend 15 to 20 minutes reading them, and it's generally written in such a way that it's not overly academic. It's more of sort of a magazine style of writing, a kind of short form essay, and pretty easy read with a lot of different broad topics covered.
Yeah, I liked that about it, definitely, that it's I love the name, Notes from Below, and it does sound like it should be a really hardcore ultra-left journal, but no, it is very, very approachable material. This is really, really good stuff.
It's something as a worker that I can actually read on a regular basis and not feel stressed out about.
Yeah, exactly. My days are spent shuffling bits of JavaScript and CSS around. My brain's kind of deteriorated by the end of the day, and I'm not always in the mood for hardcore reading. Like most of our homework. This was quite a bit more palatable.
Yes.
No, it's fantastic. Yeah, and there's a bit of there are general themes running through all the pieces, and specifically the three we've picked. But we'll get to those as we talk through them. I suppose if we kick off with prospects for organizing the tech industry, which is, I think, a really interesting essay in that it kind of posits that this tech industry, in inverted commas, is kind of seen as quite homogenous and consisting of 20-something CSS gurus, in Silicon Valley and so on. I mean, we can all kind of bring to mind an image of what that is, but it's actually
I've been to Vancouver, Yaletown. I know what that looks like.
Yeah, right. But kind of contrary to that, it's actually quite diverse, right? It's not as homogenous as you'd think, and on the first kind of level, it's actually made up of different kinds of workers. You have your a large stratum of service workers at the bottom, right, that are underpaid and definitely underappreciated, that keep the whole infrastructure of these tech campuses running. You have but even within the sort of inner core, then you have the underappreciated sort of support workers, your sort of admin staff and receptionists and so on. And then even within the core of technologists, you have the lower tiers of testers and designers and project managers, before finally getting to the coders and the senior engineers, and then to the C-level executives and so on.
Yeah, and even the coders, a lot of them are working on a temp basis, right?
Yeah, like a contracting basis, which radically kind of changes their relation to the workplace, right? And also, as we'll get to in this article, it alters their relation to like the possibility of organizing. And like a kind of a bit of a spoiler for the end of the article, the kind of like idea here is that when we're faced with this kind of question of like, how do you organize the tech industry? Like people kind of jump to like, well, how do you organize programmers? Like, and then, you know, programmers are this kind of like petty bourgeois kind of class that are like quite comfortable. And it's like, oh, that'd be really hard to organize. But contrary to all that, actually, we should be organizing from the bottom, like beginning with service workers and like the service workers that like service the tech campuses and the kind of buildings that these companies are situated in. And go up from there, kind of like building solidarity at every level, which I think is a really cool idea. And like kind of like it sort of, you know, made that click into place for me, that like I had been stuck on that kind of notion, that problem of like how do you organize programmers, you know?
Yeah, because, you know, for someone who is in that kind of petty bourgeois mentality, they you know, which is to say someone who has a little bit of capital to their name, and can see themselves either as a worker or as a capitalist, right? They're this transition class. For somebody like that, they look at capital and they see the institutional power of the owners and the managers. And they look at workers, and they see the weakness of the working class, right? So in a sense, if you can build up the strength of the workers, they may start to see the advantage of having solidarity with workers, instead of being subservient to capital, right? It becomes a more attractive proposition.
Yeah, definitely. And like there's kind of a notion here of like this kind of solidarity and organization being contagious, I suppose, that like if you start from service workers who are you know usually kind of the worst off amongst this sort of like milieu, but are also kind of like the closest to industries or kind of like workforces that were traditionally unionized or organized. You start from there and kind of like agitate for kind of like getting rid of the kind of precarity that these workers often kind of face, because like the precarity comes from like in these cases that like these service workers do like basically work for company X, except they don't. They work through a vendor who is usually this really thin shell corporation that doesn't even have its own offices. That like and the workers they go to company X's office every day, or not like the office building every day. They spend all their time on that site. They're always working directly for and like on behalf of full-time employees of company X and so on. But because they're hired through this shell corporation, they're not entitled to any of the benefits or the kind of protections that would usually come along with working for company X, right?
Yeah, it's purely a way of differentiating the benefits that are offered to different workers.
Keeping them out of the HR system for that company. And there's a point of agitation here that's outlined by the author that like the vendor is ultimately beholden to the company, and the demands of those full-time employees further up the chain do shape that kind of relationship. So it's possible to like kind of build that a sort of solidarity, I suppose, if technologists demanded that their cafeteria staff be unionized, or essentially, or demanded that they not be overworked, or that they not be exploited to the point of starvation and so on, that might be a way forward. And plus, like also these are workers that are closer to areas that have been traditionally unionized. So there's opening there. And it's actually happening already as well. Like at some tech companies, food service workers are already unionizing, for instance, which is very promising.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the time, at least in Canada, these service workers are working on the basis of like a temporary visa temporary work visa that puts them in like extremely disadvantageous bargaining position with their employer. And so they can find some allies among more established strata of the workforce, then that can help to deal with the sort of like extremely exploitative immigration policies that capital manages to get passed into law. And then that kind of benefits everybody, right? Even outside of the tech industry. Yeah, I mean, I think there are widespread possible benefits for this kind of strategy in terms of producing a society that is a lot less amenable to these kinds of really like fine-grained distinctions that capital likes to impose legally in order to like exploit people at different levels and to promote divisions among the working class.
Yeah, and like, I mean, we had the magic word there, society. Like, even if you see yourself as a like relatively privileged sort of member of this this class, like, you still kind of want to live in a society that doesn't resemble RoboCop, right? Like, there's like even if you kind of manage to convince yourself that there's no direct benefit to yourself from, you know, having this stratum of workers organized, like, you ultimately live in a society, right? Like, and it's kind of in your best interest for that to be a nice society where you're not.
Yeah, well, and I know this is a thing that's been like talked about a lot on like Chapo, but like you know, for a lot of tech workers, I guess there's kind of like this disavowal about the fact that their existence is predicated on a whole lot of sweated labor, usually people of color, often immigrants. And, you know, it creates a lot of sort of strange psychological complexes to disavow the basis for your own existence. And I think it would probably be a lot more healthy for people in that position to actually work together with the people who support their job. And to support each other, and that would lead to a lot less strange kind of ideological formations within the tech industry.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of worry about this as well, like getting. So there is that sort of all that exploitation, but I kind of worry about it getting to a kind of a newer form with these kind of newer endeavors, like WeWork, this kind of like network of kind of shitty offices that are like massively hyped at the moment. But I think the arrangement there is that like you're renting space at the location, and then the location is contracting out to you know, cleaning companies and so on. So like there's an extra layer of indirection between the kind of
right, because you'd be like possibly a contractor working for a large firm. So then you are like under one remove from the actual site of capital, and then you would be entering into a rental contract with WeWork, who would then be themselves contracting out to another company to provide the service work. And I mean, I think that may pose some issues for organizing. However, I think that just really speaks again to the need for industry-wide organizing that they bring up in this article, because that, like, presumably the service workers working for WeWork could still be a part of the same union as the service workers working at the main campus of Amazon or Google or Facebook or whatever, right?
Yeah, and that's kind of reminiscent of, like, say, the film industry as it exists, I think, right now, that even for short-term gigs and such, you're still kind of in that, like industry-wide union sort of situation. You have the same protections, even if it's just a quick a quick one-day job versus like a multi-year film project. And that's what we need an equivalent, right?
We often think about the film industry, and we think about like it being a reasonably well-paying industry, right? Like that it provides a fairly sustainable wage for people. And that wasn't always the case, right?
Yeah,
that is the result of unionization. That is the result of a labor struggle, right?
Yeah.
There is no reason why the vast armies of workers who are employed on movie making have to be paid well, right? Like like you can say, oh, but they're professionals. It's like, well,
everyone's.
I mean, so what? Like. Professionalism is it's something that involves skill, but it's also something that is created through a long struggle. You can say the same thing about nursing, right? Like it's like, nurses are paid very well these days. Partially that's because there's so many old people and therefore there's demand for them. But also that's because of a long and bitter labor struggle. And it's not necessarily the case that all of that demand for nursing services would have gone to nurses, right? Could have easily just gone to the pocket of their employers.
And I want to get back to something that came up a little bit earlier, but like there is a line in, I think it might be this article or the next one, that like these tech campuses would look a lot less utopian without this labor, right? That like the upper stratum does depend on this lower stratum's kind of underpaid labor to make this kind of function. Like look at the fucking Apple campus, right? In the Steve Jobs theater. Imagine how fucking grimy that thing would be if they didn't have the Guatemalan like imported labor doing the cleaning of the windows there to like for much less than you'd expect them to be paid, right? Like,
and I mean this is a point that is going to get to like a thing we're going to talk about down the line. But you could say, well, but of course the capitalists would just get robots to do that job. It's like, well, but the only reason they would ever do that is because the cleaning workers organized and demanded a decent salary, right? Because otherwise they're just going to use the cheap labor from whatever country they're importing workers from, right? Like it's not like they just... that this kind of picture of a utopia of workers who are all doing very engaging, fulfilling work comes about because the capitalists just decide out of their mind that, I'm going to create this utopia. No, it's the product of certainly of planning, but also of labor struggles, right? Like, because as it stands, you're not gonna design a like $1 million robot to do the landscaping for you. You're gonna hire somebody to do the landscaping for you, right? And you're not gonna pay them very much
because human beings are the cheapest machines available, right? Like as the thing that's so often missed in this kind of like automation debate, or I suppose the glowing sort of expectations of a kind of automated utopia that will just emerge naturally, is that if human bodies are the cheapest machines you can find, and you never have to repair them because when they wear out, you just fire them and they go away. That's what you actually get,
Well, yeah, and like this is like why washing machines took a long time to catch on in the UK, because people were like, why would I ever buy a washing machine? I can just hire a servant to do my laundry, right? So, that it wasn't until a change in the social relations that the washing machine actually became a viable technology. And that is because the workers and people around the workers organized to make that the case.
Yeah, definitely. And like the question of automation is kind of addressed much more in the third article. But yeah, so in this one, kind of moving on, we've got the next sort of category of like contingent workers, which is sort of like contractors, who like present a kind of a bit of a challenge there, because like it's really, really hard to organize people who are kind of fly by night kind of operatives, and they'll be potentially gone in 6 months, or you don't even know who's coming in, like and like, yeah, there's something about this as well. I think even from my sort of experience that like the author sort of talks about here, like the one reason that these contractors are brought on is for like either very specialized kind of roles or for like headcount. But also they're kind of like, the way the author puts it is that they're brought in for like, you know, outside perspective on problems. But what I've actually seen firsthand is that they're brought in kind of basically explicitly to be able to tell management the same thing that their own workers have been saying for years, but from a depoliticized, you know, in quotes, standpoint. It would be unthinkable for the management to listen to their own workers, but listening to a guy who's costing them $200 an hour is more palatable, right? Like if you have this like squad of techies who are telling you constantly that like the project is going to go off the rails, everything's on fire, and you don't want to hear that from them because it would mean that they were right, that, you know, there was some power in the workers, that they were able to actually cogently kind of explain a problem about their workplace. You don't want to hear that, right? What you do is you hire in some guy who comes in and goes, and looks at it and goes, yeah, shit's on fire. And you're like, oh my God, this guy's a genius. He's this contractor, you know, money well spent. While the full-time employees fume at how they've been saying the same thing for years and have been ignored. But of course, there's a reason they're being ignored, because to admit that the worker had any kind of involvement in production would be, you know, a grave sin.
Yeah, definitely. That is certainly the case, and it's there certainly can be these kind of oppositional roles that are played between full-time employees and contract workers. It's something I've seen on my job when I've been working contract and you know, doing the gig economy thing, and sometimes I've had moments of sort of solidarity with full-time employees, and other times I've been treated as a tool of management, which is in a sense what I was doing, right? It's not really scab labor, but it's something in that neighborhood, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's adjacent.
And it does create animosity amongst workers. And that is one of the main reasons why these these arrangements exist, right? That's why management wants to make them happen. It's divide and conquer, right?
There's no accident to this, right? Like, this is precisely why this is done. A lot of management or the kind of owners will play dumb on that. We're like, oh no, we don't mean that at all. But no, they fucking
then you like look in like, you know, the management guide for dummies, and it just says like how to manage. There's like one page, it just says divide and conquer.
Yeah,
you know, like I feel like that's kind of all they teach you in business school, but maybe that's just my perspective.
No, I think it's a pretty accurate perspective. But there's a theme here in the actual article about, like, well, you know, divide and conquer is a tactic that's used to keep us under control. And, you know, subverting that by actually reaching kind of across the aisles, as it were, and talking to each other is a really great way to, fuck over management. That becomes clearer in the next examples with, like, I kind of actually hate the phrasing here, but, like, the division between non-productive employees and productive employees. And what the author actually means is the division between, say, admins, receptionists, sales, etc., versus, like, engineers, I suppose, like the core people who are building the product. And these are segregated usually, like they're not usually kept together in the same sort of place or even the same wing of the building. So they have no opportunity to talk.
Yeah, I mean, you can call them whatever you want, but the fact of the matter is that management recognizes that this is a meaningful distinction and organizes workers accordingly.
Yeah. And the point of agitation here is to cross that barrier, right? Like, and actually speak to each other and, you know, express solidarity and to realize that you're actually in the same boat, you know, that you do have shared interests. You've more like, yeah. So like if you know, fellow programmers listening to this, you have more in common with the sales guy than you do with the CEO, right? That's very important to realize.
And I've been on both ends of this division. Like in the education sector, I've worked both of these jobs. And yeah, like I definitely have felt alienated from the other side of this equation in both roles. Like when I was a support worker in the office, I felt a certain amount of estrangement from the faculty. And when I became faculty, I felt a certain amount of estrangement from the office worker. But that's because of the way the workplace is organized, right? It is, people are put into silos. They're given different labels. They eat in different places. They have different office spaces. They have different work schedules. All of these things are created to keep people apart. But honestly, having been in both positions, I mean, in the end, you're both concerned about the same workplace, and you're both in a sort of oppositional relationship to capital.
Yeah, definitely. And like, this is kind of like the plan that's outlined towards the end of the article, that starting from the bottom, we organize the lower rungs of the hierarchy while encouraging those further up to offer solidarity downwards and, I suppose, meet in the middle, or, eventually reach the sort of upper rungs. There's a layer of these organizations that are beyond saving. They've the sort of bourgeois aspirants of the layers directly below the C-level executives and so on. They'll never be on board for it, but like, fuck them. So
yeah, I mean, yeah,
they're not your buddy.
You can only build solidarity with the people you can build solidarity with. That's this is why like right to work is a terrible idea. Like
yeah, it's grisly. And again, to kind of like emphasize one sort of last point, that like what this really calls for is an industrial union, not a like collection of craft unions. Because like having a programmers union and then having a sales guy union and a cleaning workers union and a cafeteria workers union or whatever isn't going to cut it, right? Like you're still going to be in silos and not actually recognizing that you're all literally in the same enterprise together, right? Like that's what's going on in your workplace. We really need instead an industrial union that like not only crosses the kind of divides between these different sort of professions within the same context, but also the divides between workplaces, right? Like that, or between different sort of companies and sites.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a kind of a bit of a digression, but I remember reading an article once from a labor activist in Europe, and he was talking about, so the interviewer was asking him, given the European financial crisis that's happening, given all of the austerity measures that governments are rolling out across Europe, why is labor not able to provide a pan-European response to this issue? And a lot of what it comes down to is stuff like, well, our schedules are different from one country to another, or the rollover on our contracts is different from one country to another. And all of these kind of like minor organizational trivia points do add up to a significant weakness in actually being able to present a united front against capital. And that is a sort of critical flaw of craft unionism that you can really see.
Certainly. So yeah, I think I like this article. It's got really good sort of diagnosis of the kind of like the core sort of problems we're facing, and a kind of like good prescription for a united front against capital.
Yeah, they sort of give some examples here of why those full-time employees might actually want to participate in a unionization drive too, right? Like, sort of concerns about the ethics of production, right? Like, so this is stuff like many tech workers not wanting to admit the fact that they work for an advertising company.
Yeah.
Right. and management deliberately obfuscating that, this idea that they are working on a quote unquote campus, and that this is like a knowledge industry, and that they are driving forward technical progress and like advancing the productive forces of humanity, and like all these things are heavily emphasized, or like bring people together and this kind of stuff, right? Like we're connecting people, all that kind of thing. But the fact that all of the money for these companies comes from advertising is a sort of open but dirty secret, right?
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect between the kind of utopian vision, right? Of I mean, we've been over this in the Californian ideology and so on, but like that vision of like creating value for users and all this sort of stuff, and then what actually you're doing is selling ads, right? Or making infrastructure to sell ads.
It's like surveillance, and there's like one end, like the one end of the equation is surveillance, and the other end of the equation is advertising sales.
Yeah, and like as much as like the kind of programmer tier are not sort of outlined here as being the initial point of agitation, like the kind of like there is this idea of kind of agitating from the bottom up. Like there is massive dissatisfaction even within techies as to like their work, right? Like I think this thing about like, oh, we wanted to actually change the world, but now we're actually selling ads instead. That's something I think we're all, like myself, of course, and all of most of my colleagues and like everyone in the industry is actually kind of like intimately familiar with and has internalized as like this being a problem. So it's like it might actually not be that far of a stretch to like agitate around those points and be like, well, okay, if you actually want to improve the world, right, like you want to improve people's actual fucking living conditions, clearly leaving all of this stuff up to the dictates of the kind of ownership class isn't good enough, right? Like, and it's evidently not worked out so far. So now maybe it's time to try something different, you know? I think it's, fertile ground, certainly.
Yeah, and this is something that you can kind of see a precedent for in like the political situation in France in May 68, and then following May 68 to some degree, up to the election of Mitterrand, where you had technical workers and managers to some degree brought on board with the socialist project because of arguments like this, right? Because of like things like autonomy, right? You're talking about how the bosses decide the direction of projects, and the engineers feel like they could do this themselves, but they feel like, or they experience the fact that they are all kind of siloed off and given orders and not actually able to do the things that they want to do and that they see right in front of them as potentials, right? And instead they just have to follow orders. I know, like, I spend some time working with people in the games industry, and that is a major stressor and source of complaint in the games industry, right? That like, at a certain scale of production, if you're talking about like a Ubisoft game, like like Far Cry 5 or something, like this is something that is rolled out across like multiple gigantic studios across the world, and each person working on a part of that game is really just like, doing widget production, right? And this feeling of mental exhaustion that comes from that sort of top-down work experience, and the desire for an ability to think about what they are producing as well as think about the content of their work, drives a lot of developers into doing indie development. I've definitely heard that from a lot of developers I talked to in the indie space, who are just like, yeah, I left because I couldn't handle the work culture anymore. But then that is a fraught proposition, right? Because that is that is an extremely competitive market with very low returns for most people. And yeah, you might be good, but are you good enough to, win the lottery on what game happens to get to the front of the Steam, featured page on the right day? Because I've met developers who are like absolutely outstanding and make outstanding products, and their games just get slept on, and it's like financial ruin for them. So I think that in a way, unionization is a more attractive proposition for workers like this, especially given the fact that those kinds of independent petty bourgeois avenues of attempting to realize their dreams and their desires for fulfilling work are becoming more and more fraught and imperiled.
Yeah, like it's as much as the sort of professional or programmer tier or whatever you want to call it is like a relatively privileged position within that industry, and just like a relatively privileged class, I think, in society in general. Like there still is, like, it's not like it's a kind of, it's not like there's an absence of consternation either, like, or of problems within itself, right? Like that we are still alienated from our labor. We're still kind of exploited. Still have like that division of planning from execution, which keeps us kind of separate from the ability to kind of decide the direction of our products. Despite the fact that, like, with say at the very least with open source work, we know for a fact that it is possible to democratically run vast like technological projects. Which kind of is a great segue into the second article, which is about bringing back the Lucas Plan. The Lucas Plan was, so to give it a context, like there was this company, Lucas Aerospace, I think, let me look them up on Lucas Industries. I think that's the kind of proper term, in the UK. And in 1976, there was this thing where the management decided, well, we have to lay off a bunch of workers, big layoffs. And in response, the workers, across all parts of the kind of the business, got together and proposed, like, kind of put forward a counter proposal that would retool what the firm was doing, and like propose different designs or different technologies that they could build as alternatives. And this was remarkable, like in a kind of like a positive plan to retain jobs and reorient the firm towards like socially useful applications of the company's technology and skills. But the crucial thing here is it was directed by the workers, like both the wrench jockeys on the floor and the designers up in the kind of the higher levels, all in concert with the union representatives and everyone, all involved, getting this plan together and demonstrating that, like, actually, like, workers can in fact direct production or and design and planning.
Yeah. It is quite inspiring, and it gets back to the previous discussion we had about alternative forms of ownership, where in that document it was somewhat nebulous, like, how worker ownership would actually make any difference socially, right? Like, it's like, okay, well, I could kind of see like they would get some more returns from being the owners, but in what sort of qualitative sense would that make a real difference for society? And you can kind of see in the example of the Lucas Plan that, like, no, like, if workers are actually able to manage production and direct production, they can move the direction of technology and technological development into a more pro-social direction, right? So, like, if you're talking about the aerospace industry, obviously you're talking about potentially arms production, right? And moving away from that and towards something that is more helpful for society in general is really inspiring, right?
It is, yeah, certainly. And like the kind of the analogy that's kind of used to kind of bring this over into like contemporary technology circles is that like right now we're kind of seeing like a pretty serious backlash against like the kinds of purposes that technology has been directed towards recently, like this surveillance, just the kind of abject shittiness of like what these social technology or the social networks have kind of created. And we're seeing serious widespread sort of criticism, and like the question has got to be kind of raised. Well, like could all this kind of creative and technical energy not be directed towards something more humane and something that would actually have positive effects on society? And it can, because like technology is political and its design is political. The current design is carried out by capitalists for capitalists. It's not in the service of humanity at large. It is in the service of profit, specifically like just the extraction of value from these systems and its hoarding and accumulation. And like it's that can be different. Like there's no concrete, there's nothing inscribed in the fabric of the universe that says that the direction of socio-technical development must be dictated by this small class of owners, right? It is entirely possible that we could, sort of, dare I say it, collectively direct the process as workers, as the Lucas workers tried to do. And I mean, like, ultimately, the initiative failed. Like, I mean, it'd be a different history if it had worked, but it's inspiring. It really is.
Yeah, and even at the time, it was recognized as inspiring. It was given sort of a global headlines,
Yeah.
In terms of like, wow, they're doing this really incredible thing. It's just, it was, of course, the managers didn't particularly like it.
Manager's going to manage.
They conspired
right?
to destroy the plan, but hey, that's why you need solidarity beyond just one plant.
Right. Yeah. There's a great line. There's a quote here from New Statesman that the philosophical and technical implications of the plan are now being discussed on average 25 times a week in international media. Like it was big stuff at the time, huge, and it briefly opened up this kind of space of possibility. But yeah, like so the author moves on to this kind of question of like how do you do something like that today with the kind of technical sort of industries as we know them today, and yeah, it's like it's again kind of this like class composition thing, or the composition of the workforce, like what we saw in the previous article, that like there are these divisions within technology industry between these like masses of underpaid workers who are kind of like, or even beyond the sort of example of cleaning the offices, like we're talking about the moderation teams, right, for Facebook and so on. Electronics assembly, the people who are constantly fucking forgotten, like the Taiwanese kids who are like putting the fucking laptops together, or like mining getting the minerals to put the laptops together and all that sort of stuff, right? Like that's all dependent labor, or even like the warehouse logistics stuff. Like we're all familiar with the ghastly fucking conditions that Amazon warehouse workers have to live with.
Yeah, it's like something we don't want to think about, but it's real, right?
Yeah. And then again, we've got the kind of like the higher stratum kind of getting towards a petty bourgeois kind of character there. And like the author also points out here, like I think it's stuff we've sort of been discussing, but like that stratum also has its own grievances, and like stuff like the lack of autonomy and the kind of crushing overtime in many cases, leading to burnout, and so on. But yeah, and I suppose it's sort of again a call for industry-wide sort of action, like and organization, that like like the thing about the Lucas plan again was that it wasn't just the designers up in the kind of draft rooms that were putting forward this plan. It involved everyone, including them and the shop floor workers, and like every worker in between was involved. So like I think the analogy here is that like simply setting up like a programmers union isn't gonna work, right? Like it's just gonna end up being a union for programmers. It's not going to be a tech union, you know, in quotes.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also very important to the socialist project in general, because what we saw for example, in Chile, and this is a thing we will probably talk about if we get to covering cybernetic revolutionaries, is that because the technical workers and managers were not brought up in this kind of program or this kind of movement, they did not have a mentality of solidarity with the other workers, or the disposition to treat them as equals and as intelligent human beings. They often tried to find ways to sabotage directives that were coming down from on high in order to do more sort of democratic production, right? Like the government was saying, do this kind of stuff, but there was resistance at the level of the workplace because the culture did not exist to actually realize that kind of dream, you know? It's not like, you know, it's not like you work in this place and you're completely hived off from the other sector of workers there, and you only relate to each other in the most perfunctory ways. And then the government says, oh, now you're going to all be comrades and you're all going to work together and struggle. And it just instantly happens, right? It's much more likely to be successful. That kind of programs would be likely to be successful, not just through propagandizing or for directives, but also through, you know, the development of workplaces where this sort of culture is actually developed, and there is a real sense of solidarity and mutual respect and recognition among workers.
Yeah, and like the watchword here, or the watch phrase, is workplace control, right? Like workplaces by the workers for the workers, and that includes everyone, right? From the apprentice floor cleaner all the way up to the guys who are running the you know, artificial intelligence pipelines, all together in a firm, like an enterprise, like trying to achieve a goal, right? Like it's there really has to be that cross-cutting solidarity for everyone. And the article closes out with quite a nice bit about kind of like bees and architects, and it's a quote from Mike Cooley, who was one of the authors of the Lucas Plan. I'll just read out the quote. The alternatives are stark. Either we will have a future in which human beings are reduced to a sort of bee-like behavior, reacting to the systems and equipment specified for them, or we will have a future in which the masses of people, conscious of their skills and abilities in both a political and technical sense, decide that they are going to be the architects of a new form of technological development, which will enhance human creativity and mean more freedom of choice and expression rather than less. The truth is, we shall have to make the profound decision as to whether we intend to act as architects or behave like bees. Which I think is pretty good, you know? That is, like, that's exactly how I feel, right? Like, I would strongly prefer we have a, you know, planet of architects rather than bees.
Yeah, and I mean, I remember talking to Andrew Feenberg, who's a philosopher of technology and has written a lot about this kind of subject. And I remember him saying that he kind of came away from the May 68 protests in France with that sort of idea in his head. Like, you know, like we really gotta work on this. This is really, really important. To change our relationship to technology and to each other. This is a pressing matter for our time, and it's been a long time since 1968, and there's been a lot of efforts to do that, right? There's a lot of talk among the tech industry, among government, about creativity and initiative and entrepreneurship and all that kind of stuff. but really building, technological projects that are based on wide-ranging solidarity and recognition is something that we still have yet to really achieve, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like we're kind of getting, well, we're not getting there, but the seeds are being planted, right? Like that we're already seeing technology unions, or like sort of organizations that are trying to unionize the tech from the ground up and so on, starting to get traction. And it all kind of feels like a powder keg in a way, that like, because we see tensions at every level, right? Like we see tensions within the kind of the substrate of workers whose work the higher levels depend on. We're seeing the kind of consternation even within that kind of upper layer as well, as to like the nature of the work they're carrying out. We're seeing backlash from society at large as to like, well, why the fuck are these huge companies off the leash entirely to kind of do this kind of shit? It's becoming clear that we don't in fact have a that kind of vision of a technical utopia that would generally improve all human lives. It's not fucking happening right now, right? Like, and if we still want it, then there's work to be done.
It just doing your job and working hard and expecting that that's going to produce the vision that you want to see realized in the world. It's not going to work, right? We got to do something different. I know, like, we're both workers. We both have to deal with the realities of the workplace. I understand how difficult it is to try to break the mold, to try to do something that is not on script. But that's the only way we're going to make this happen. It's not working harder doing the same thing. That just does not work. It does not produce change.
It really and truly doesn't. So the next article is called "The Future of Work, Automation and the Left." And as you can probably tell from the title, there's a lot to be said in here about automation. And like, it kind of opens with this thing that like it is the one of the big buzzwords of the century, right? Like it's on everyone's lips. And the threats are all very obvious, right? Like I think that gets plenty of airtime. The threat of like displacement and loss of jobs and kind of like widening inequality and so on. But there is also opportunity there, right? That like we at one point in the past dreamed of like post-work societies, or even just like a reduction in the amount of fucking toil that we do every week. And this wave of automation does offer us some kind of possibility of actually getting there. Yeah, which I think it's quite a nice article in the way it lays this out. Our society is organized around work, right? Like that's kind of one of the opening points, is that like every goddamn thing we do is built around this institution of work. But like so much of it is either horrendous or just bullshit, right? Like it's or both, right? Like we're all, as I mean, in Marxist terms, all kind of alienated from our labor, but then a lot of it is just fucking pointless anyway. It's like not actually useful sort of work, but we're still fucking doing it.
Well, and the thing that Marx appreciated about the capitalist mode of production, as opposed to previous modes of production in this regard, was that in capitalism, society is transparently oriented towards work, right? Like yes, the work may be garbage, we may be alienated, but at least we know that the basis of our existence is work. And that is something that capitalism makes clear in a way that other modes of production do not, right? Like if you were talking about feudalism, people get caught up in ritual, or they think about the religious basis of their existence, their soul, all these kinds of things. But in capitalism, we relate to our labor as the fundament, the basic structure of our society and our lives. And we also experience our capacity for doing different kinds of labor, because we're not in a pure caste system where we are stuck doing one job for our whole lives, and that's just what we do. And the rigid structure of society that dictates that we do that job becomes more significant than the fact that we are doing it, right? And so in capitalism, you have that ability to move from one job to another, and you see that you are, pretty much fundamentally related to your capacity to work. And yeah, it's not great, but at least we can recognize the problems there.
And it's just the thing here is that it just structures fucking everything. It structures how we conceptualize everything. Like, the things that people study, right? Like the things that, we'd go to university for are all conceptualized in terms of like useless degrees and like versus STEM or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I know. Like I do vocational education, right? Yeah. Like 90% of what I teach is vocational. It is English for the sole purpose of getting a job, and there's the way the course is structured. There is no broader meaning to it whatsoever. It is just a thing you do in order to get a better job. And maybe some students come into it with a different motivation and can get something else out of it, but most students are brought into the course because of government directives, because of advertising, because of the structure of the way the economy is laid out, looking for that vocational education. And I mean, that's okay in a sense, but I find that it ultimately does get in the way of even providing the vocational education that they supposedly want. Right? Because you're a lot less likely to successfully learn English if the point of what you're learning is radically isolated from your entire life and what you care about. And this kind of move towards vocational education and education that is focused purely on the job hunt, and on job related abilities, I think is extremely deadening and demotivating for most teachers and students. And one thing that's kind of been bothering me a lot recently, I've been thinking about, why are people so attracted to Jordan Peterson's work, right? It's this huge best-selling stuff, right? And partially I think it's the controversy he cultivates, but that doesn't really explain it, right? That doesn't get you to the top of the bestseller lists, right? I mean, there's plenty of people who are just hacks who go around and cultivate controversy. And I think it's partially the fact that he's just gesturing to the idea of education or a life of the mind that is not purely instrumental and focused on moving up the job escalator, right? Getting the qualifications you need to move on to the next stage. I think that our society has become so focused on that, it basically leaves people feeling like the content or their everyday lives are completely meaningless. And except to the extent that it advances them up the next stage. And then when they get to the top of the escalator, there's nothing there, right? Yeah. So I think that, when Peterson's talking about these really deep structures of meaning that go back centuries and so on, we have to read these great books and all this kind of stuff, at least he's talking about something other than, what is the new hot CSS framework, right?
It's
or how can you improve your test score on your English test or whatever it is, right?
No, I buy it. I think that's a good analysis. And I think the author kind of sums this up pretty well, I think, in kind of saying that we don't work because it's necessary or because it produces things of value or because it enriches us. We work because our economy is structured in such a way that for most of us the choice is either work or starvation. That is the thing that structures all of that, and that's the thing that Peterson is just gesturing towards there, the possibility of a possibilities beyond that. The simple choice between working and dying, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
It might in fact be fun to read a book for fun. Or for some enrichment of the mind, right? But this thing has taken over everything.
Yeah, that's the thing that he's pointing to, is like that there is such a thing as enrichment of the mind, right? It's not just a matter of like a Brave New World style ingesting of pleasure stimulus,
yeah,
right? Like,
God, how fucking depressing is it that like that guy is the only person in the kind of public sphere that's doing that, and he's such a fucking right-wing dipshit. Like, it's...
I mean, I think politically it's disastrous, because he's drawing people into some pretty toxic politics with a line and a performance that is addressing some really legitimate issues.
Yeah, but like the author then kind of gets on to like kind of getting at like why this is the case. Like we've established that this damn thing fucking structures everything, and it like I think observably doesn't actually produce that much in the way of like value, or it like doesn't produce as much value as it thinks it produces. But the reason for this is that like when 1% of the population controls most of the disposable wealth, what we call the market reflects what they think is useful or important, and the ruling class like has figured out that actually no, like happy and productive people and workers is actually a really dangerous thing, right? That's kind of what the author is saying here, that like there's a reason for this, and it's a class struggle, it's the magic word, it's class struggle. That was great. It's really sort of a nice
and this gets back to the Graeber article that we read, right?
I think he's actually quoting Graeber here, or
right. That's right. Yeah, directly quoted Graeber. Yeah,
our good old friend.
It's for a different Graeber book, but yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but yeah, and like there's a great line here as well from the author that like, if hard work is its own reward, like this, if you buy this idea from the ruling class, if hard work is its own reward, then why are we working harder than ever and miserable about it? Like this clearly doesn't work, right? But like automation does offer a sort of a way out of here, right? Like that. We could, do the fully automated luxury communism thing and end up in a delicious sort of Star Trek style post-work utopia. Like it's a direction we could try and go, because like there is a history of like socialists specifically like wanting to reduce the work week. I mean, the only reason we don't work 7 days a fucking week right now is because socialists agitated for that in the past. And even non-socialists, right, like Keynes and such, like were of the same sort of persuasion at one point. There's no reason we couldn't be of the same persuasion today.
Yeah, it's really interesting that like we've got so caught up in consumerism. It's like they talk about in this article here. The combination that we face today is 19th century Protestant moralizing plus consumerism plus the ideology of quote unquote self-fulfillment. And that sort of triad has led to us prioritizing, and I don't think this is the only reason, but it has led to us prioritizing income over free time. And, another reason why we might prioritize income over free time is because we are all in a mutually antagonistic relationship as consumers, and we're all terrified about the starvation that they talk about at the beginning of the article. Yeah. But I think that kind of push stimulus is accompanied by this pull stimulus. There was a really good video essay I saw on the recent Apple Home ad that was rolled out. That was it, like Spike Jones did this really slick advertisement for Apple Home, which is about this woman basically experiencing the hellish grind of commuting, and then coming home and like being transported into this incredible wonderland of self-fulfillment by way of her Apple Home device, right? And just like really wild cinematographic techniques used to portray this idea and to make it convincing. And this is the guy who did Her, right? So he's very plugged into and knowledgeable about this kind of subject. And yeah, I mean, I think it's a real thing. Like we do try to construct this self-image by way of our purchases, and I do think it distracts from the struggle to reduce our work time. Yeah, and so we have to think about that as much as we have to think about appropriating the social product, right? They're both necessary.
Yeah, like this is such a kind of multi-dimensional sort of project, right? Like that, like the core demand here is, and I think it's kind of put very well in the article by a quote from Aaron Bastani. That, like, you know, full automation of everything and common ownership of everything that is automated is the core demand, right? Like we're after a transformation of the very core relations of the society, also transformation of how we relate to wealth, and transformation of all these other things. Like there's a lot like that needs to change, and it needs to be a multi-pronged kind of movement. And I think that it's important because, like, the one of the things that's raised here in the article is again, like, universal basic income as a potential way to do this, or like reducing the work week and such. And I'm kind of worried about, like, getting too hung up on these individual sort of reforms, right? Like, because I think universal basic income on its own is actually kind of like, it would be very easy for the idea to simply be hijacked by capital, or, like, again,
in the same way that welfare was.
Right. Yeah, right. Exactly. Or like the reducing the work week. Of course you can reduce the work week. Your hours are cut in half and your salary is too. Ooh, you know, you want more free time, right? So I think all of these reforms and these solutions need to constantly be rooted in the kind of, like, fundamental transformation of relations, that, like, because and the same goes for the universal basic income, right? That like we said this in the green room, but, like, who wants to put down a bet that, like, the gigantic mass of proles in the Blade Runner films, they get a basic income consisting of, you know, those parcels of maggot sludge that they eat.
And I mean, that's literally what it meant to be a prole in Roman times, right? Was that you got a universal basic income of bread from the state. That was what defined being a prole. Was you got your bread from the state and you subsisted off of that, and it, you know, that's not great.
It really isn't. Yeah. So, like, I'm a little bit sort of wary of just, like, talking about universal basic income in a vacuum, essentially. That, like, I think it absolutely needs to be rooted in this, like, deeper vision. And it is stuff that's gotten to in the article. Like, I'm not saying that this is especially a blind spot for the author, but that, like, I think we're at great risk of kind of going down blind alleys there of, like, proposing. I think like maybe it's partially that, like, as leftists over the last 4 decades or whatever, or 3 decades, however long it's been, we've gotten kind of accustomed to, you know, hiding our light under a bushel, as it were, that, like, not really saying the core demand, like the actual transformation we want to see, but instead proposing these, you know, like, minor sort of reforms as, like, oh, well, you know, if we do this thing, then it would be a step towards this sort of thing. And without getting into the whole, like, radical versus reform sort of stuff, like, I think it does need to be rooted in an actual kind of, like, core goal that we won't let go of. That, like, we need to constantly reaffirm that common control of the means of production is exactly what we're after, and that UBI or whatever might be a path towards it, but we're not going to give up on that actual goal.
Yeah, because at the point that, it's a matter of not putting the cart before the horse, right?
Right. Yeah.
to put it very simply.
Yeah.
If you put the particular reforms before the political project, then you're just going to end up with that bare subsistence level of basic income that libertarians dream of.
Yeah, that's already on our fucking doorstep, right? Like, the libertarians, those psychopaths have already taken this up as their fucking banner, right? Like, it's in a way already been lost that way.
Yeah, and it's pretty easy to see the way this can happen when you look at something like the way that welfare programs directly subsidize the labor costs of Walmart, right? Where the Walmart trainers, when they bring workers in to the company, give a lecture on how to apply for welfare payments, because this is an expected subsidy to the wage that Walmart pays, right? And that, that's a scenario that's very easy to imagine. If everybody's getting universal basic income, they just go, well, okay, well, we'll just reduce the wages accordingly. And then, there's also the question of where do the taxes come from that pay for these, right? That's a major issue. And if it is not coming from the rich, then it's coming from the middle class, or at least it's coming from, the upper stratum of workers who are going to be slaving away, supporting the lower stratum, while all the profits go to the top capitalist stratum.
Well, it's almost as if the correct answer is a total reorientation of like the very notion of the possession of wealth within the society, right? Like, yeah. I think that's very much the correct answer. But I think we've gotten off on a bit of a digression there. But like, I think it is an important sort of point that like it's just a thing I go off on every time universal basic income is brought up. That it needs to be coupled to this other stuff.
Well, it's because you run into people who are social reformers, and they become incredibly fixated on specific reform measures. So I feel like a lot of this sort of going off thing is kind of a reaction to the enthusiasm of some people for specific reforms. The silver bullet approach, right?
Right. It's in keeping with our sort of current, hegemonic thinking of like, marginal tweaks around the edges, right? Like if we just find the right dial and turn it 3 degrees to the left, it'll all figure out, right?
And it is kind of like the twisted legacy that we've inherited from the sorts of reform experimentation that we saw in Markets in the Name of Socialism discussion, right? That is like an aspect of neoliberalism that has come down to us, where it's like, this enthusiasm for reform measures and the tweaking and the pulling and pushing of pulleys and levers and adjusting the machine, but like not in a fundamental way, because that's the part that got lost, right?
Yeah. I think there's I've just been reminded of kind of another sort of like bit of the article that I'm quite fond of, where the author sort of points out that there's actually quite a bit of tension even within the left about these sort of reforms, these universal basic income and so on, or the tension between the kind of fully automated luxury gay space communism crowd and the kind of more traditional sort of worker oriented left, and like, or that like the kind of insistence there is that, well, instead of kind of thinking about this full automation, we should instead kind of agitate for better working conditions and shorter hours and that sort of stuff, which is, well, like we should, absolutely.
It's the trouble with that issue, or the trouble with that approach, which the author points out, is that you can't guarantee that the workplaces which you improve will even be there in the future, right? So if you're improving it on a purely workplace by workplace level, you're not really guaranteeing that workers continue to have access to the general social benefits, right? The general social product. So that is a valid concern, but I can see where both sides are coming at this, right?
Yeah, and I think like it specifically reminded me of the kind of arguments put forth by the kind of like communizers, or the kind of like ultra left sort of guys, that like that there's this sort of thing that, like, if the working class wants to eventually abolish itself, then getting kind of bogged down in last century's worker movements maybe isn't the way to do that. But I also do see the immediate sort of thing of, well, like, our actual working conditions right now fucking suck. So we kind of do actually need to pay attention to that as well. So, like, it's I don't really have a side in that kind of thing. It's just, like, it's a very interesting kind of tension that we'll have to deal with.
Yeah, and I feel like it's something that is like a matter of strategy that I just don't feel really informed enough to give a very clear statement on, because I find a lot of these issues you can kind of talk about them in the abstract like this if you are at a distance, but once you actually get involved in organizing, you do start to get a clearer position on them because of what you see and what you experience and what you perceive to be working and not working. And I think this kind of, like, detached perspective we have because, like, neither of us are active labor organizers. It does lead us to this kind of sitting on the fence position, right? Because in the abstract, there is an argument to be made for both of these things, and I think that's kind of the best we can say about it.
I'm gonna have to get into this organizing work. So maybe I should just quit the main job and do that. No, that is something that plays on my mind, right? That, like, there's a very we have a desperate sort of need for both, like, fresh ideas for this century and to actually crack on with the work of organizing. And it's, like, really hard to find, like, time and energy to do both, right? Like, but this ties back in with what we're actually discussing in this very episode, that, like, I mean, if I was to start organizing any kind of a workplace, it would be my own, right? Like the workplace of a technology company. And that's very much the open question that's in this this set of articles. Like, this is a new field of endeavor because we haven't been organizing these workplaces for like fucking how long, we've got entire, like, cohorts of these kind of, like, knowledge workers and technologists and stuff who have, like, gone through university, gone into their, like, early jobs and then grown to become senior engineers or what have you, who have done all of that in conditions of never having been organized at all. Like, there's a deeply embedded culture of just, like, the opposite of organization. Big challenges ahead, but, like, we kind of have to meet them.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of where we come to is, like, this is both necessary and extremely difficult. Okay, but I think the thing that does work to our favor is that when you actually work on these things with other people, the sense of solidarity you get and the experiences you have in your praxis, they do help to fuel the movement, right? What appeared to be daunting to the point of impossible can become something that can actually be realized, right? And that's like, you can imagine the people involved in the Lucas plan, right? Like, the fact that they even made it as far as they did was probably at an earlier point in their life something they never would have even conceived of.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, we have to get reaccustomed to this idea that things can change. And
I mean, I feel like the tech sector has changed so much in the last just 3 years, like what we consider to be possible in this situation. It's hugely different. And it's not just some dispensation from God. This is something that people have done collectively. The fact that there even was a labor panel at GDC this year.
I mean, like, what enormous.
Like, who would have thought that would ever happen, right? That's incredible. And,
like, I've been saying it this episode, but, like, I think it really is a tinderbox that's kind of, like, on the edge of just going off. Or, I mean, hopefully, could be hopefully I don't find myself 50 years from now thinking back on this like time of optimism, but as a failure. But, like, no, I mean, like, it really seems like this is starting to happen, right? Like, I mean, even in this article, the author gives examples of like the UK's Green Party are kind of pushing for a 4-day work week. I mean, they're not a huge party, but they are, and like they're doing that, and like even the other ones, Labour, but kind of really talking openly about basic income, and like I think actually probably more interestingly, basic services, and like services that are simply free at the point of use, which I think we should maybe schedule an episode about this sort of thing, but I think is maybe a better avenue of investigation than a basic income might be, because you get into the decommodification stuff then, which is part of these changing fundamental relations in the society, and like France is kind of, I think, instating a 35-hour week and so on. There's a bunch of countries
that's been around for quite some time now.
Oh, has it?
Since
Right.
the 90s. Yeah. And I mean, it has its own contradictions and issues, but it is something that has persevered. I don't know how long it will survive under Macron, but hey, at least there's people out in the streets fighting that bastard.
Yeah, like he's got to run the country like a startup, right? You should be doing 70-hour weeks and grind and overtime and all this shit, right? Like,
oh no.
Yeah, but there's I think we skipped ahead a little bit actually. That there's a good sort of bit here about like kind of what does come next with these kind of like shift into a post-work sort of future, and like kind of like we can do things that matter to us, like care for each other and spend time. Like there's also bits about like the reimagining of the city and our living situations as possibilities when we break the vice grip of work on our lives. We can reimagine what it means to actually kind of live together.
And we have to reimagine the city because we're living in a age where Amazon is a reality and is utterly destroying the commercial fabric of cities, right? Like that. Like, the city must be reimagined. Like, they call back to Red Vienna as an example of, like, this socialist project to reimagine living circumstances. And this is something I've studied quite a bit in my doctoral studies. And, part of the reason why there was that period of innovation in housing was because there were tremendous social changes going on and there was a need for new arrangements. And I think we live in a similar period today, right? The face of the city is changing. The face of our productive and consumptive relationships with one another is changing, and that does create an opportunity to reorganize the city. But unless we have social power, that will be done on the basis of capital, not on the basis of what we want.
Right, exactly, and that's how you get Blade Runner. not a desirable thing. And that really is the core of it, right? That like our current trajectory is. Like we're in a society that is organized by capital for capital, and we want to change that, like to a society that is by humans for humans, like by labor for labor. And like so the conclusion of this article is that like automation isn't like something that's coming, or like or even like widening the scope from automation. Like these changes and these like changes to our societies and our living environments, they're not on the way. They are here. They're happening now. And we on the left have absolutely got to wrestle with this, like, and to deal with it, because it's not going to go away. We can sort of like, I think there are some on the left who would prefer to kind of like close their eyes and click their heels together and wish themselves back to 1914, but it ain't fucking happening, right? Like the choice we have is to alter the trajectory we're on and switch to another one where everyone can enjoy the fruits of this automated labor. And actually live in a nice world. I mean, that's shouldn't be that crazy of a desire, really, should it?
No. Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna have to talk about surrounding topics more in the future, because we've done this kind of broad overview with these articles, and it'll be worth talking about some of these issues at more length as we go along.
I think one that we've kind of got in the pipe and for an indeterminate time in the future is that both in this set of articles and in the Labour paper we looked at, the kind of notion of a kind of left-wing accelerationism has come up in both places, and I think we'll probably take a look at that. Maybe like specifically the left flavor of accelerationism, and also just kind of acceleration in general, like kind of where those notions come from. Because it's a recurring theme, and it seems to be like I don't think I actually quite got to verbalize it in the alternatives episode, but the fact that the other party in the UK is kind of like actually putting basically left accelerationism in their writings is significant, right? Like that has to be something that's acknowledged as actually quite significant. That so whichever way it turns out, I think it warrants investigation, certainly. No, cool. I enjoyed these 3 articles immensely, and the rest of I read some of the other ones. So there's like 15 or something of them. So, and I've been quite busy in the last couple of weeks, so I haven't gotten around to all of them. But this is good writing, and I would strongly encourage anyone to check out this website. And yeah, I need to get around to reading their first issue, the first set of articles as well. Because this supposedly is a sort of a follow-on in theme from that set. But great work from whoever it was that was involved. Didn't have quite enough time to look that up, but
yes, please refer to their website for the citations.
just go look at the thing.
Who is the Class Inquiry Group? You can find out.
Yeah, cool. Is there anything else we'd like to cover before we wrap up?
No, I don't think so. There was a minor point about this final article here, sort of overly pushing the idea that, of course, capitalists invest in automation, in automation, right? Of course they do, but we know that's not the case, right? It's not automatic that capitalism invests in automation. We read that entire Graeber article about the flying cars and the falling rate of profit, about why that isn't the case, right? So it's kind of getting back to that idea that if we want to have serious technical progress, we have to push it as workers, because capitalists are pretty much happy just sweating labor, as we talked about earlier in the episode. If you are a landscaper and you do your job for below minimum wage or barely minimum wage, capitalists aren't really going to invent a robot to replace you, right?
No, because you're so cheap, right? And when your hand gets caught in a fucking weed whacker, they just lay you off. It's like, oh, you're a contractor, get fucked.
So
cheapest machines in the world, and you don't even have to repair them.
And I think that point was sort of overemphasized by this State of Automation article, right? So that was the one minor corrective I sort of wanted to bring up regarding that article.
Yeah, and we did an episode on that article we mentioned. Any of y'all latecomers to the show need to go back and listen to that. Thanks, listeners, for coming along with us on this one. If you've been enjoying the show, maybe consider heading on over to patreon.com/General Intellect Unit and throwing us a few bucks a month. Any little bit of help just helps us to pay for books, feed ourselves, basic maintenance of the organism. And otherwise you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook as General Intellect Unit, and we're on all the podcasting apps, so if you haven't done so already, maybe think about subscribing, and if there is a facility to do so, maybe leave a review or something. I don't think anyone's ever done that yet. There's no reviews on iTunes for us, so
you can be the first.
Trailblazing. I think that's about it. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
See you.